Ammon had lived so long that people had stopped speaking of his age as years and had begun speaking of it as weather. They said he was older than the olive groves east of the valley, older than the first walls of the river cities, older than the road of black stone merchants used when they came from the southern deserts with salt, dyes, and gold dust. Children whispered that he had seen the world when it was still clean. Old women, half in awe and half in fear, claimed he remembered the voices of men now buried so deeply their bones had become part of the earth. No one could say for certain how much of that was true, but everyone knew this. Ammon had outlived nearly everyone he had ever loved. He had buried brothers, sisters, cousins, wives, sons, daughters, and grandchildren. He had seen plagues come and go, kings rise and fall, fields become cities, and cities become ruins. He had walked through vineyards he planted as a young man and later watched strangers harvest their grapes. He had heard the same sins renamed by each generation as though evil became new merely because younger lips spoke it. Yet for all his years, Ammon was not a hard man. Age had not made him cruel. It had made him sad. His eyes were pale and heavy-lidded, yet still sharp enough to make liars look away. His beard fell white as winter reeds to the middle of his chest. His hands trembled now when he lifted a cup, but in their bones remained the memory of strength. Those hands had once carved cedar, dug grave, held newborn children, and closed the eyes of the dying. They had struck men when justice required it, and held weeping faces when grief demanded gentleness. He lived in the household of his son Garin, on a rise of ground overlooking a great valley where towns and farms scattered outward like seeds. Garin was not as long-lived as Ammon, though even at his age he seemed carved from patience rather than flesh. He had inherited his father's broad brow and steady gaze, but there was more silence in him, as though he carried a thought too heavy to set down. He spoke little in company and never wasted words. Men often took that for weakness until they discovered it was restraint. And then there was Donald, Garin's son. If Ammon was a fading sun and Garin a banked fire, Donald was a storm held inside a man. He was strong, deliberate, and strange in a way the valley never forgave. He laughed rarely, but when he did it was honest laughter, free of mockery. He worked harder than any laborer on the slope, yet had no pride in it. He listened more than he spoke. He had the troubling habit of looking at the horizon as though expecting it to answer him. People said Donald was too serious. People said Donald thought himself holy. People said Donald was not made for ordinary life. Ammon, who had lived long enough to recognize the sickness of other people's judgments, knew better. Donald was not proud. Donald was burdened. He had been burdened for years. The first time Ammon truly saw it was one late evening when the sky over the western ridges burned copper-red. The workers had gone in. The sheep had been pennied. Wind rolled through the long grass with the sound of distant water. Donald stood alone beyond the house, staring toward the valley cities where fires were beginning to kindle in the dusk. Ammon stepped out with his staff and lowered himself beside his grandson on a flat stone. "You look," Ammon said, "like a man waiting for bad news that has already arrived." Donald did not smile. "Perhaps I am." Ammon studied him. "Is it a woman?" "No." "A debt?" "No." "A quarrel?" Donald shook his head. Ammon was too old to circle a matter when the center could be reached more quickly. "Then speak plainly." Donald breathed in slowly. "I have heard a warning." Now Ammon's fingers tightened around the head of his staff. He had heard many things called warnings in his long life. Priests with theatrics, kings with omens, drunkards with visions born from fermented honey, yet the way Donald spoke was different. There was no excitement in it, no self-importance, only dread. "What warning?" Donald kept his eyes on the horizon. "That the violence of men has risen too high, that the earth groans beneath it, that judgment is coming." Ammon said nothing. The valley below them glittered with evening fires. It looked beautiful from a distance. But Ammon knew what lay within those towns and cities. He knew of courts where truth was sold. He knew of merchants who rigged their scales and called it wisdom. He knew of girls traded to settle drunken bargains and boys taught to enjoy the suffering of animals so they might later enjoy the suffering of men. He knew of blood feuds carried across generations like heirlooms. He knew of men with soft hands and fine robes who ordered killings and never saw the bodies. Judgment was not hard to imagine, but judgment from heaven was another matter. Ammon turned to Donald. What form? Water. Ammon let out a dry breath. Water. Yes. We have storms, rivers flood, wells fail and fill. That is not the ending of the world. Donald swallowed. Not river water, not a flood from one valley to the next, a breaking open, a drowning of all things under the heavens. Ammon stared at him. The evening wind seemed to grow colder. At last he asked, "And how was this told to you?" Donald lowered his voice further, though they were alone. "In the night, in waking, in the silence between, however I name it, it remains true." Truth. The word struck Ammon with more force than he expected, because buried in the oldest chambers of his memory was another truth, or something like it, a sentence spoken over him when he was born. His father had been a severe man, not cruel but haunted. Ammon still remembered his lined face bending over him when he was small, still remembered the way his mother hushed conversations whenever Ammon entered the room, still remembered hearing, again and again, a saying he came to hate. When this child dies, it will be sent. He had spent half his life rebelling against those words, and the other half trying to forget them. Sent what? No one knew. His mother thought it meant war. His uncle feared plague. One wandering seer claimed it meant fire from heaven. Another claimed it meant the fall of kingdoms. The years stretched long. Nothing came. Men who once trembled at the saying died. Their children forgot. Their grandchildren laughed when it was retold. But Ammon never forgot. And now Donald sat beside him at dusk, speaking of judgment by waters. Ammon rose too quickly and nearly stumbled. Donald caught his arm. "Grandfather, do not call me that right now." Donald let go. Ammon stood looking over the valley, his old heart beating like a fist against a door. When at last he spoke, his voice was hoarse. "Tell me everything." So Donald did. He spoke of the corruption of men, of a command to prepare, of instructions too vast to be sane, to build a vessel large enough to preserve life through destruction, to gather stores, to warn whoever would listen, though few would, to endure ridicule, to keep building though the sky remained bright and empty. When he was done, dusk had deepened into night. Ammon listened to the insects in the grass. Far below, the distant cities throbbed with music and noise. Somewhere a dog barked, somewhere someone laughed. The world had never sounded more doomed. Garin found them there long after dark. He came carrying a lamp, the flame wavering over his worn features. When he saw their faces, he stopped. "What has happened?" Ammon turned to him and said the one thing he had prayed never to say aloud. The old sentence was about this. Garin set down the lamp very carefully. For a moment, no one moved. Then Ammon repeated the prophecy over his own life, the sentence he had carried like a thorn buried beneath the skin for centuries. When this child dies, it will be sent. Garin closed his eyes.